All right, here's another sinusoidal word problem. It says that you're aboard a submarine, submerged in the Pacific. At time t equals 0, your submarine makes contact with another vessel. This is a Fuller number. You do not even need that. And starts porpoising, going deeper and then shallower. At time t equals 4, so here's your first point that they're giving you. You are at the deepest level of negative 1,000 meters. So we know right away that we're going to use the cosine function because they're giving us a deepest point to start with as the deepest point. So we're going to use this equation. Some books use different A, B's, and C's in different places, but this is the one that most textbooks in our district use. So we're going to use that equation and we're going to put some points down. So at t equals 4, so we'll call that t equals 4, it's at the deepest level, which is negative 1,000 meters. So let's make our little chart in here. So we know it's going to be underneath. So there's my XY axis. Let me draw that one a little bit straighter. There's my XY, and so this is 4. That's 4 seconds. Is it 4 seconds or 4 minutes? Time t equals 4, whatever. Probably 4 minutes. I don't know much about submarines. And this is negative 1,000. Okay, so that's my deepest point. And then it says at time t equals 9, you reach your shallowest point, which is 200 meters. So that's up here. Negative 200 meters. That's your shallowest point, and that's at time t equals 9. So this is your point right there. At 9 minutes or whatever, that's the shallowest you get. So you never get closer to the surface because you went below the surface. It doesn't really matter what happened before at time t equals 0. Like I said, that kind of was throwing you off a little bit because at that point you hadn't really started your sinusoidal. Your sinusoidal motion happened, your porpoising motion happened starting at 4 minutes or whatever that value is. And then you went here. Now the trick to this one is that they only gave you half a period, right? Because they're going to have to give us another low point. So we're just going to put that extra low point in there. And if this distance was 5, then another 5 is going to put us at 14. And there's our full cosine graph. Again, cosine because it started at a low point. So it's going to be, let's find all those values that we need. So first of all, let's find A, and A is this distance right here. We're going to have to find that midline. The midline, let's call it right here. What is that midline right there? We'll take this total distance, which is 800, and split it. So what's half of 800? It's 400. So what's 400 away from negative 200 in the negative direction? Negative 600. So negative 600, actually, that tells us D. This is negative 600. That told us D. And then A is this distance right here, which is 300. And it's a negative 300 because I'm starting on the bottom. So, sorry, not negative 300, my bad. Negative 400. Sorry, negative 400. So A is negative 400 because that's the half of the distance between the maximum and the minimum. That's your amplitude. And your amplitude could be a positive or negative value depending on if you're starting at the bottom or if you're starting at the top. Since we're starting at the bottom, it's going to be a negative value. So A is negative 400. Now our shift, well, let's do our period first. The B has to do with the period, right? So our period, like we mentioned, is a total of 10 minutes or seconds, whatever that is, units, 10 units. So that's our period. So B equals 2 pi over the period, which equals 2 pi over 10, which is pi over 5. So this is pi over 5. Pi over 5 is my B value. And then C, notice that I shifted. I didn't start, normally I would have started here on the x-axis. I'm sorry, on the y-axis. But I didn't start there. I shifted over 4 units, 4 time units, which means I went to the right 4, so C equals 4. So your equation, let me write it more neatly, is y equals negative 400 times the cosine of pi over 5 x minus 4, minus 600. And to test it, just grab one of your values, one of your points. Let's take 9. If I plug 9 in for x, I should get negative 200 for y, because 9 negative 200 is one of my points. So let's test it. If I plug in 9, 9 minus 4 is 5. 5 times pi over 5 is just pi. The cosine of pi is negative 1. Negative 1 times negative 400 is positive 400. Positive 400 minus 600 is negative 200, so that checks out. You can do it with another one as well. And a lot of times they'll ask you, at the end they'll ask you something, what's his depth at time, at time t equals 6 or something like that, in which case you just plug in 6 here and calculate the things out. Now if they want those extra points here, that point right there actually is going to be between 4 and 9. Halfway between 4 and 9 is actually 6.5. So this point would be 6.5 comma negative 600. And you could do that as well. You could use that as one of your checkpoints. Plug in 6.5 here instead of 9. 6.5 minus 4 is 2.5. 2.5 is the same as, well, what's 2.5 is half of 5. So that becomes the cosine of pi over 2. And the cosine of pi over 2 is 0. So this whole thing goes away and you just get negative 600. And that's exactly what you should get. Same thing if you plug in this point right here, which is 2.5 away from 9, which would be 11.5. 11.5 minus 4 is 7.5. 7.5 is 3 pi over 2. 7.5 divided by 5 is 3 halves. Follow? So 3 pi over 2, the cosine of 3 pi over 2 is 0. So that cancels out again, and you get negative 600. And sure enough, that's your point. 11.5 comma negative 600.